A country building thousands of kilometers of fences not for people but for pests. Doesn't it sound weird? Well, in the heart of the Australian outback, workers set up lots of wire and mesh across barren landscapes to keep out invaders. Critics said it was unnecessary, but a decade later, the results were crystal clear. Not only did these fences protect livestock and crops, but they also started one of the most unexpected ecological turnarounds in modern history. How? Keep watching because you're about to find out how Australia quietly pulled off a global conservation miracle. Let's begin. Now, why Australia built the longest wire fences? For us to fully understand why Australia built some of the longest wire fences in the world, we need to go back to the year 1859. That year, a wealthy settler named Thomas Austin released 24 wild European rabbits onto his Victorian estate so he could hunt them. However, in just a few decades, the rabbits multiplied from 24 into hundreds of millions. They spread across much of southern Australia because it was a sort of rabbit paradise. There weren't many predators. There were loads of grasslands and the climate was extremely favourable. By the 1890s, the rabbit population grew so large that farmers reported seeing entire hillsides moving not from wind, but from rabbits. Undoubtedly, the rabbits took a huge toll on the economy, and it wasn't a good one. Rabbits devastated the entire landscape. They brought about soil erosion, too. At one point, the rabbits were estimated to have destroyed millions of Australian dollars worth of agricultural output annually. Today, that's hundreds of millions of US dollars. The government tried everything they could to stop the rabbit invasion, but nothing worked. It was extremely frustrating. Then fortunately there was a breakthrough. The idea of building a barrier came up, and it wasn't a barrier for people but for animals. So the construction of the first major rabbit-proof fence started in 1901 in Western Australia. It's officially called the State Barrier Fence. Basically, it keeps rabbits in the eastern states away from the southwest. Eventually, it stretched over 1,800 kilometers, and it became one of the longest unbroken fences in the world back then. The logic behind the structure was pretty simple. If you couldn't exterminate the rabbits fast enough, maybe you just shut them out. However, the fence was a total engineering nightmare. The workers faced extreme heat, dust storms, and water shortages as they dragged rolls of mesh across terribly harsh terrains and weathers. Supplies were carted in by camel or horse-drawn wagons. Additionally, maintaining the fence was a constant battle. Shifting sands buried some sections of the fence and floodwaters washed other sections away. The entire situation was extremely difficult to deal with. Also, the final cost was crazy for its time as it cost over £80,000. But remarkably, the plan worked at least for a little while. The fence slowed the rabbit invasion long enough for agriculture in Western Australia to survive and expand. It saved tens of millions in crop and pasture losses and gave farmers a sense of control they hadn't had in decades. Subsequently, by the 1920s, more fences were constructed. Now, these new fences weren't just against rabbits, but also dingoes. Dingoes are native Australian wild dogs blamed for attacking sheep. And these fences weren't just symbolic. They were lifelines for entire rural communities. With time, they reshaped more than just farming. They became really powerful tools for conservation as well. Obviously, building a fence to stop animals might sound simple. It's just a fence, right? But Australia is a continent that's over 7.6 million square km, so drawing a line through the wilderness was everything but simple. All the continent's major exclusion fences have their own geography, purpose, and challenges. Like I just explained, the State Barrier Fence of Western Australia was originally built for rabbits, but with time, the initial rabbit control purpose faded. Soon after, the fence got upgraded to keep away emus, wild dogs, and kangaroos. Then there's the dingo fence, which is still one of the most ambitious pest control projects ever. At its longest, it spanned over 5,600 kilometers. Today, it's maintained at about 5,300 kilometers, which is still pretty long. Let me explain. If you lay the fence out across Europe, it'll stretch from London to Istanbul and then nearly back again. It's a bit funny that if you somehow found a way to unravel and straighten all of Australia's major exclusion fences, they'd cover over an eighth the length of the equator. Together, Australia's exclusion fences span thousands of kilometres, some of the longest networks in the world. In Queensland, something newer came up in the 2010s. It's called cluster fencing. Instead of one gigantic cluster fencing barrier, farmers grouped their properties into clusters. They built hundreds of kilometres of predator-proof fences around each group. Basically, they aim to block out wild dogs, kangaroos, and feral pigs, and ultimately bring sheep farming back to life. But these fences aren't just built and left there. People live within them, which means that maintaining them is a year-round job, and it's quite a hard one as well. In remote places, workers have to deal with a lot of harsh weather. A single break in the fence will undo years of protection, so lots of maintenance is necessary to keep them standing. Also, in places inside South Australia, the fence isn't just a barrier. It's kind of a line between two different worlds. On one side, sheep farms exist with reduced predator pressure. On the other side, predators roam freely. These lines, even though they're made of wire and mesh, carry heavy consequences. They define where livestock thrives, where native species are safe, and where Australia's battle against invasive animals will be fought next. Now, remember, I loosely mentioned a fence called the dingo fence earlier on. Well, let's unpack that. So, the dingo fence is one of the longest man-made structures on the planet. It starts in Jimba, Queensland. From there, it cuts across New South Wales and stretches all the way to the cliffs of the Great Australian Bight in South Australia. That's thousands of kilometres of fencing, and it goes right through some of the toughest terrain in the country. At first, back in the 1880s, the goal was to stop rabbits. But as time went on, things changed. In the early 1900s, the fence was rebuilt and also extended. Why? To keep out dingoes and protect livestock from being attacked constantly. In a way, it was like the front line of a battleground. And practically, it did much more than simply keeping predators away. It basically drew a line through the continent. To be fair, at the north and west of the fence, dingoes roam free. These areas are healthier with more balanced ecosystems. But south and east of the fence, there's a very different story. Dingoes are mostly absent. Without them, fox and cat numbers exploded like crazy. Regrettably, that's bad news for native wildlife. Small mammals declined sharply. Even so, for many farmers, this dingo-free zone is a lifeline. It basically is the difference between them staying in business and losing everything. By the 1950s, the fence became more than just wire and posts. Scientists started calling it the dingo line. Today, satellite images show dingo line the contrasting vegetation patterns on either side of the fence. On one side, there's natural patterns of vegetation and predator-driven ecosystems. On the other, neat patches of farmland shaped by human control. Regardless, keeping the fence standing is definitely not a small task. Maintenance crews called fence runners still patrol it today. Their job to find and fix breaks caused by storms, animals, or erosion. They tighten loose wires, repair gates, and check electric lines. It's really tough work, but it keeps the line strong. Still, the dingo line isn't free from controversy. Conservationists say it disrupts natural processes. Some argue that it harms biodiversity inside the fence and creates an unnatural balance. In contrast, others believe the fence helps to maintain ecosystems that no longer work on their own. Additionally, indigenous groups raise deeper concerns. For thousands of years, they coexisted with dingoes using traditional land practices. So, the fence comes with both its good and bad sides. Okay, so fences may seem simple anywhere else, but in Australia, they've caused changes in the land use, vegetation, and wildlife patterns. Take the dingo fence for example. It was initially designed to keep away dingoes, and it succeeded. But the success came with side effects that no one fully predicted. Outside the dingo fence, the story is a bit different. Although the livestock losses to dingoes are higher, so is biodiversity. Native species like the bilby live much better in dingo-controlled environments. Strangely, it turns out that dingoes suppress populations of these more destructive invasive predators. So, they bring balance to the ecosystem. Additionally, the Western Australian state barrier fence has effects that were sort of similar. Originally designed to stop rabbits, it became a bulwark against emus, kangaroos, and feral pigs. Yes, it stopped crop destruction and diseases from spreading, but it affected habitats, too. Species that needed to migrate seasonally were blocked, and others that bred too freely inside the fence created overpopulation problems. The more recent cluster fences in Queensland tried to avoid these mistakes. Still, critics worry about long-term consequences. What happens when predator control shifts ecosystems in ways we don't fully understand? They just have to wait and find out. Indeed, when Australia fenced the outback, it wasn't because they wanted to preserve wildlife and nature. It was a financial gamble to save the nation's wool and crop industries from collapsing totally. And it definitely wasn't cheap. The original rabbit-proof fence cost over £250 per kilometre to construct. By the time it was completed in 1907, they hired thousands of workers to build and patrol it. These people worked in brutal conditions, often hundreds of kilometres from the nearest towns. Supply lines needed to be established. Depot needed to be constructed and inspectors were also stationed at intervals along the length of the fence. Some people argued that all this money spent on fences and their maintenance should have been spent on other things like modern surveillance, predator control programs, things like that. And for a little bit, it seemed like they were right. But over time, the numbers told a different story. Studies show that properties inside cluster fences saw livestock losses from predators drop by over 90% in some fenced regions. Additionally, the quality of wool improved and lamb survival rates rose as well. Farmers who were in the face of financial ruin because of wild dog attacks found themselves making profits once more. As the years went by, Queensland's fencing initiatives were said to have added millions to regional economies, according to government and industry reports. Furthermore, in regions that suffered overpopulation from kangaroos, some cluster-fenced areas decided to reduce large-scale calling. This is because they were able to manage the kangaroo numbers before they spiraled. Moreover, pasture recovery got better and this lessened the need for supplemental feeding and soil repair. The fences also acted as biosecurity barriers. In other words, they helped to prevent the spread of livestock diseases and feral pig incursions that devastate crops. For the government, the return on investment became really hard to overlook. After all, fencing significantly reduced losses and boosted productivity. In Western Australia, the upgrade of the state barrier fence, adding new sections and electrifying old ones, was backed by millions in state funding. It was justified because it saved a lot, which would have been spent on crop protection, and it also reduced the need for constant aerial pest control. And beyond all the money, the fences proved something long-lasting. That targeted infrastructure could transform fragile industries, not with chemicals or subsidies, but with smart physical boundaries that tilted the scales in favor of the farmers. The gamble paid off. What started desperately became something worthwhile. The once overrun outback slowly got its economic foothold back. For this reason, 10 years after renewed investment in pest exclusion fences surged across Australia, the results are practically impossible to ignore. Many people mocked the idea and regarded it as an outdated, brute force solution, but it delivers some of the best conservation and economic wins in recent Australian history. Back when Queensland started its cluster fencing program in the 2010s, skeptics derided it as a waste of public funds. They argued that fences were static, expensive, and could be breached easily. But by 2023, new data painted a different picture. Some said properties inside cluster fences showed an increase in lambing rates. Additionally, pasture recovery improved. And that's not all. The need for lethal control of native grazers was reduced as well. Moreover, farmers noticed better body conditions in both sheep and cattle. Generally, agricultural output soared. In regions like Barcaldine and Longreach, farmers who once called thousands of kangaroos to prevent overgrazing found that fencing created better and more controlled wildlife access. The system restored balance to once fragile grasslands. Pest species like feral pigs, which were impossible to contain, dramatically reduced in the fenced regions. But perhaps the most unexpected thing was the fence's effect on native wildlife. Once the fences went up and the predators were shut out, something remarkable began to happen. The native species returned. At places like Scotia Wildlife Sanctuary, strong fences served as safe zones. Inside them, endangered animals were able to recover and breed, and this became the new model. Use fences not just as barriers, but as ecological resets, contain the threat, then rebuild from within. The economic benefits were big, too. According to some industry reports and case studies, the economic returns from fencing projects sometimes reaches tens of millions in value-added gains. For example, a project in the Murray-Darling Basin is expected to return $15.5 million to the local economy with an investment of $11.1 million. Another project focusing on the South Australian dog fence is predicted to generate up to $120.3 million in benefits over 20 years, including job creation and increased cheap enterprise income, while also reducing wild dog management costs by up to $97 million. That's much more than they cost to build. Towns hit hard by drought and predators saw new jobs, higher land values, and better resilience during climate shocks. Moreover, fencing brought in a way to control pests without using chemicals. This is really important today because people's pesticide concerns are on the rise. In the remote regions of Australia, the fences aren't just a physical barrier. They're also a very useful and practical tool to manage ecosystems. However, the approach has its challenges as well. Some experts say that fencing isn't a universal solution. It needs regular maintenance and consistent monitoring so it stays effective. Additionally, local support and flexible land management have to be provided as well. In some areas, it's led to new problems like overgrazing inside the fences or having to manually control kangaroo numbers. Still, for the first time in decades, there's concrete evidence that invasive species control works, but only if it's done at scale with patience and precision. And here's something that might surprise you. Australia's use of fences has now become a global model for wildlife recovery. Inside protected zones like Scotia Sanctuary, New Haven, and Arid Recovery, scientists have used exclusion fences to bring back animals once thought to be nearly extinct. In some cases, native populations of bilbies, betangs, and wades have increased by over 300 within just a few years. These fenced areas act like living laboratories, showing the world how physical boundaries can reverse the damage done by invasive species. In fact, international conservation groups now look to Australia's fenced sanctuaries when designing similar projects in Africa, New Zealand, and North America. So, while the fences started as a blunt tool to stop destruction, they've become something much more powerful, a blueprint for ecological hope. In a world struggling with biodiversity loss, that's a legacy worth paying attention to. Australia's fences started as a desperate attempt to stop pest invaders and secure their lands. And years later, they've proven their worth. What seemed laughable became legacy. An outdated idea has become a key part of Australia's land management strategy. Because sometimes the simplest solutions just need the patience to prove themselves right. What do you think about the fences down in Australia? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this.